There is no silence so deafening as a palace built for children that never arrived. For 5 years, the Duchy of Blackwood has been a tomb of marble and missed opportunities, haunted by the ghost of a woman who was told her womb was as barren as the winter frost. But as the Duke prepares to take a new bride to secure his bloodline, a carriage arrives that will shatter the silence forever. This is not a story of a lost love found. It is a story of a queen's vengeance, a father's awakening, and the secret that was poisoned before it could ever bloom. If this story stirs your heart, please subscribe and like to support the journey. Tell us in the comments what city you are listening from and if you believe Julian deserves Seraphina's forgiveness. Chapter 1. The Decree of Emptiness. The great hall of Blackwood did not feel like a seat of power, it felt like a gallows. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and the sharp acidic tang of ink. Outside, a tempest hammered against the stained glass windows, reflecting the turmoil within the breast of Julian Vane, the Duke of Blackwood. He sat upon his high-backed chair, his fingers gripping the carved lion heads of the armrests so tightly his knuckles were the color of bleached bone. Before him stood the council of elders, men with skin like crumpled vellum and hearts hardened by centuries of blood purity and ancestral obsession. At their center stood the royal physician, a man whose narrow eyes and thin lips had dictated the fate of the duchy for 3 decades. "The line must continue, Your Grace," the eldest councillor wheezed, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across stone. "The Duke without an heir is merely a tenant in his own palace. The Duchess has been wed to you for 3 years. 3 years of nothingness." "She is not nothingness," Julian snapped, his voice a low, dangerous growl that would have cowed a lesser man. "She is the Duchess. She is my wife." "She is a field that will yield no harvest," the physician interjected, his voice oily and clinical. "I have examined the humors, Your Grace. I have charted the cycles. Her Grace is stony ground. To keep her is to let the Blackwood name wither on the vine. You must sign the Decree of Nullity, for the good of the realm." Julian looked at the parchment on the table. It was a cold, cruel thing. The Decree of Nullity. It didn't just end a marriage, it erased it. It declared that Seraphina had never truly been his wife because she had failed to fulfill her divine purpose. It was a public shaming, a branding of her soul as defective. The doors at the far end of the hall swung open. Seraphina walked in alone. She did not weep, she did not plead. She wore a gown of pale blue, the color of a winter sky, and her dark hair was swept up in a style that emphasized the elegant swan-like curve of her neck. She looked every inch a queen, yet she was being treated like a broken vessel. Julian's heart twisted. He loved the way she hummed when she painted in the conservatory. He loved the sharp wit she used to dismantle the pomposity of his advisers. But he was a man raised on duty, a man told from birth that his pulse belonged to the state, not to himself. "Julian," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in the air. He could not look her in the eye. "Seraphina, the council they have reached a conclusion." "The council has reached a conclusion, or you have?" she asked. The silence that followed was agonizing. The physician stepped forward, holding the quill like a dagger. "The decree is ready, Your Grace." With a hand that shook with a violence he could barely contain, Julian signed his name. The ink bled into the paper. It felt like signing her death warrant. "It is done," Julian whispered, the words tasting like ash. "You will be provided for, a cottage in the Northern Territories, a pension. I want nothing from a man who weighs my worth by the contents of my womb," Seraphina said, her voice rising with a sudden, searing heat. She looked at the council, then at Julian, her eyes flashing with a mixture of heartbreak and a terrifying nascent strength. "You believe the physician. You believe I am the reason the halls are silent." "The science is absolute, Grace," the physician sneered. Seraphina looked at Julian one last time. "You chose a crown over a heart, Julian. I hope the gold keeps you warm at night." She turned and walked out into the storm. Julian watched from the high balcony as she boarded the ship that would take her away. The rain lashed against his face, blurring his vision, but he stayed until the sails disappeared into the grey maw of the sea. He believed what he had been told. She was Barren, and he was a duke who must survive. 5 years later. The Duchy of Blackwood had become a Grave-Duchy. Julian moved through the corridors like a spectre. He had closed off the west wing, but he could not bring himself to clear her rooms. The scent of her jasmine perfume still lingered in the heavy velvet curtains. Her half-finished embroidery sat on a small table, the needles still rusted in the silk. He had become a man of shadows. He drank his brandy alone in the library, surrounded by the portraits of his ancestors, all of whom seemed to be judging him for the silence of the nursery. The council was relentless. The blood purity they craved was now at risk of extinction. "The Lady Isolde is a perfect match," the councillors urged him daily. "She is young, robust, and her family is known for their fertility." Julian loathed Isolde. She was a woman of sharp angles and sharper ambitions, a predator draped in silk. But the pressure was a mounting tide. The neighboring provinces were whispering of civil war, eyeing the empty cradle of Blackwood as a weakness to be exploited. "Fine," Julian had finally snarled, throwing his glass into the fireplace. "Set the date. We shall have a remarriage ball. Let the world see me trade my soul for a successor." The night before the ball, Julian stood in the nursery that had never been used. He ran his hand over the railing of a mahogany crib. He had been told Seraphina was stony ground, yet every night for 5 years he had dreamt of a child with her eyes. He felt a phantom ache in his chest, a yearning so sharp it felt physical. He did not know that at that very moment a ship was docking at the harbour. He did not know that the stony ground had brought forth a miracle, and that the woman he had cast out was returning not as a supplicant, but as a storm. Chapter 2. The Remarriage Ball. The ballroom of Blackwood Manor was a dazzling cage of crystal and gold. Hundreds of candles flickered in the great chandeliers, casting a warm, deceptive glow over the assembly of the ton. To any outsider, it was the social event of the decade, the remarriage ball, a night where the Duke of Blackwood would finally signal his intent to move past the barren years and secure the future of his line. But to Julian, standing on the dais beside Lady Isolde, the air felt thick with the scent of lilies, a flower he had always associated with funerals. Lady Isolde was a masterpiece of calculated beauty. Her gown was a pale, shimmering silver, and her smile was as sharp as the diamonds at her throat. She leaned closer to Julian, her hand resting with proprietary ease on his velvet sleeve. "You look quite grim for a man about to embark on such a joyous journey, Julian," she whispered, her voice a silken purr. "The council is watching. Smile, just a little, for the sake of the succession. "My smile is not for sale, Isolde," he replied, his voice a low vibration of discontent. He looked out over the crowd, but he didn't see the glittering gentry. He saw the empty space at his side where Seraphina used to stand. He remembered the way she would lean in and whisper a joke about the bishop's wig, making him struggle to keep his ducal composure. Across the room, the royal physician stood with the council of elders, sipping wine and nodding with smug satisfaction. They had won. They had pruned the unproductive branch and were now grafting a new one. The orchestra began a lively quadrille, the violins soaring toward the high painted ceilings, but suddenly the music faltered. A single violin screeched as a bow slipped, and then, one by one, the instruments fell silent. A strange, heavy hush rippled through the ballroom, starting at the grand entrance and washing toward the dais like a tide. The master of ceremonies, usually a man of unflappable dignity, looked at the calling card in his hand with a face that had gone ashen. He cleared his throat, his voice cracking as he made the announcement. "Her Imperial Highness, the Princess of the Southern Isles, Seraphina Vane." The name hit Julian like a physical blow. The room went deathly still. The heavy oak doors swung wide. This was not the broken woman who had sailed away in a storm. Seraphina did not enter the room, she took command of it. She was draped in royal crimson and gold, colors that practically vibrated with power and vitality. Her hair, once kept in modest coils, was now a crown of dark waves adorned with rubies. She looked more like a queen than she ever had as his duchess, vibrant, untouchable, and dangerously beautiful. But it was not her presence alone that stopped the hearts of every person in the room. Walking beside her, his small hand tucked firmly into hers, was a young boy of about 4 years. He was dressed in a miniature version of a gentleman's formal attire, his posture unnervingly straight for one so young. Julian felt the world tilt. The boy had the unmistakable Blackwood brow, prominent and brooding. His eyes were not the soft brown of his mother's, but the piercing silver-flecked grey that had been the hallmark of Julian's family for generations. And there, as the boy turned his head to look at the towering statues lining the hall, was the final, devastating proof. A dark, jagged birthmark on the side of his neck, the mark of the lion that had appeared on every firstborn Vane male since the Middle Ages. The boy's gaze moved from the statues to the man standing frozen on the dais. The child's eyes widened with a sudden, innocent recognition. "Mama?" the boy asked, his voice high and clear in the absolute silence of the ballroom. "Is this the man from the statues? Is this the king you told me about?" Seraphina stopped at the foot of the dais. She did not curtsy. She looked up at Julian, her expression a mask of icy composure that hid a simmering volcano of 5 years of spent rage. "Not a king, Leo," Seraphina said, her voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall, cutting through the shock like a blade. "Just a duke who forgot that life is not a decree to be signed, but a truth to be lived." Julian's breath hitched in his throat. He tried to speak, but his voice was a strangled wreck. "Seraphina!" Isolde's hand tightened on his arm, her nails digging into his skin through the fabric of his coat. "Julian, this is a trick, a common parlor trick. She's found a foundling who bears a resemblance." "Silence!" Julian roared, the sound echoing off the marble walls. He stepped down from the dais, his eyes locked on the boy, on his son. The royal physician stepped forward, his face a mask of sweating terror. "Your Grace, this is impossible. The medical humours, the charts. She was barren. I swore it on my reputation." Seraphina turned her gaze to the physician, and for a moment the heat of her hatred was so intense the man actually recoiled. "Your reputation was bought with gold and tears of the moon, physician, but nature is far more resilient than your poisons." She looked back at Julian, who was now standing only a few feet away. He reached out a hand, his fingers trembling as he moved them toward the boy's face, but Seraphina stepped slightly in front of the child, shielding him. "He has your eyes, Julian," she whispered, her voice dropping to a tone meant only for him. "But he has my heart, and unlike you, he will never be taught to trade his soul for a crown." The ballroom, once a place of celebration, had become a theatre of the soul. Julian looked at the child he was told could never exist, then at the woman he had sent into the maw of the sea, and finally at the remarriage he had agreed to. The silence was no longer empty. It was screaming with the weight of 5 years of lies. Chapter 3. The Tears of the Moon. The Duke's private study felt smaller than it had moments ago, the air thick with the scent of old leather and the ghost of 1,000 regrets. Seraphina stood by the window, the moonlight carving her profile in silver. She looked like a marble goddess of vengeance, while Julian felt like a man crumbling into dust. Young Leo sat on a low velvet ottoman, his small fingers tracing the gilded spine of a book. The sight of him, the living, breathing evidence of Julian's own blood, was a knife to the Duke's heart. "How?" Julian's voice was a jagged wreck. "The physician, he swore to me, Seraphina. I watched him perform the examinations. I saw the tinctures he gave you. He said your body was a frozen wasteland." Seraphina turned, her eyes flashing with a cold, brilliant fire that silenced him. "My body was not the problem, Julian. It was the tea. Every morning for 3 years, Lady Isolde brought me a tonic for my health. She spoke of sisterly care and the heavy burden of a duchess. In reality, she was feeding me tears of the moon." Julian froze. He knew the name, a rare, bitter herb used in the darkest corners of the city to ensure a woman never bore a child. In high doses, it mimicked the symptoms of permanent barrenness and induced a slow, lethargic wasting of the spirit. "They poisoned me," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibrato. Isolde wanted the title, and the physician wanted the gold she promised him once she was duchess. I only realized the truth during my final week here. I stopped drinking the tea out of sheer despair, and by the time I boarded that ship in the storm, the stony ground was already blooming. I gave birth to your son in a fisherman's cottage while you were here, mourning a memory and entertaining my murderer." A primal, guttural roar of agony and rage escaped Julian's throat. He turned to the desk, the very desk where he had signed the Decree of Nullity, and swept everything off it in a violent crash of ink and glass. "They will bleed for this," he vowed. He did not wait for the guards. He did not call for a trial. He grabbed the original Decree of Nullity from his safe and strode back into the ballroom. The music died instantly as the Duke of Blackwood, looking like a god of war, marched to the center of the hall. He caught the physician by the throat, his eyes burning with a terrifying light. "Look at the flames," Julian bellowed to the stunned court. He threw the decree into the roaring fireplace, the parchment curling and blackening in an instant. "This document is ash, just as the lies that built it are ash. Lady Isolde and the physician are stripped of their titles and lands this night. They are banished from the sight of the sun in Blackwood. If they are seen within my borders after dawn, they shall answer to my sword." The room was a vacuum of shock as the guards hauled the traitors away. Julian turned to the crowd, pulling Seraphina and Leo to his side. "This is my wife, this is my son, and this is your future." The justice was swift, but the healing was a slow, agonizing winter. Seraphina did not fall back into his arms. When Julian tried to take her hand in the hallway that evening, she pulled away as if his skin was scalded. "You chose your throne over my word, Julian," she told him, her voice hollow. "You believed a man with a chart over the woman who shared your bed and your heart. You let me walk into a storm because you valued a legacy more than a life." Julian did not argue. He knew that to win her back, he had to cease being a duke and start being a man. The weeks that followed were a quiet revolution. Julian spent his mornings not in council meetings, but in the overgrown gardens with Leo. He taught the boy how to skip stones across the lake and how to recognize the call of a red-tailed hawk. He sat on the grass, ruining his fine silk breeches, just to hear the boy's laughter, a sound that finally filled the Grave-Duchy with light. Seraphina watched them from the balcony, her heart a fortress under siege. She saw Julian's humility. She saw him dismiss the council of elders when they tried to speak of purity again. She saw him spend hours in the library, writing a new set of laws that would protect women from the very decrees that had exiled her. One evening, by the fireplace in the nursery, Julian found her tucking Leo into bed. The boy was fast asleep, clutching a wooden lion Julian had carved for him. "I cannot undo the 5 years," Julian whispered, standing in the doorway. "I cannot erase the storm, but I will spend every breath I have left proving that I am worthy of being his father, and yours." Seraphina looked at the man who had once been her world, then at the son who was her everything. The ice around her heart didn't shatter, it thawed, slowly and surely. She reached out, her fingers grazing his hand. "Start by being his father, Julian," she said softly. The rest we shall find in the truth." The second wedding was held on a midsummer afternoon. There were no cold councillors, no political agendas. There was only a man, a woman, and a small boy who held the rings with a grin that could light the world. As they stood at the altar, Julian took Seraphina's hand. He didn't look at the crown or the court. He looked only at her. "I once thought a legacy was built on blood and decrees," he whispered. "I was wrong. A kingdom is built on the fierce protection of the ones we love." The Barren queen was barren no more. She was the mother of the empire, the fierce protector of a line that would never again be traded for a title. The palace of Blackwood was no longer a tomb of silence, but a home filled with the thundering footsteps of a miracle. Julian had traded his crown for a family, only to find that in doing so he had become a true king. The fire had tested them, but the truth had set them free. Thank you for following the journey of the Vane family. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption and love, please subscribe and like. Tell us in the comments, do you believe a love broken by betrayal can ever truly be the same?